Tonight's presentation is by Garret Crift. I say that correct?
Yes, you did.
And it's about Native American Indians in the Northeast, and maybe touching a little bit on the Clarendon area as well.
Yes.
I don't know if Timoth is in there, but...
Oh, yes. No, it's the entire town of Clarendon and what it encompasses.
And environs, eh?
Yes. So, as Phil said, my name is Garret Crift. I have been living in Clarendon now for roughly 3 to 4 years. So, my education comprises of a bachelor's degree from Castleton University in sociology and anthropology. And I have worked for Matthew Moriarty in the South Champlain Ecological Project, which was an archaeological dig that took place in West Haven. But there's a disclaimer, I am by no means, I have no master's in archaeology or anthropology, I have no PhD, etc. But in the future I plan on hopefully getting that. So I am by no means an expert, but this has been a point of my study when I was an undergraduate student, and it has continued to interest me since. And this whole presentation is going to be the abridged version of everything, because it's relatively impossible to just collect everything and squish it into an hour to 2 hours. All this information would have to be something that is read, studied about over a day's period. So I included the things that I found necessary to just get the point across and to not put too much detail out there where it could just be way too confusing. So this is very abridged. So to start, it is from the beginning, which for Vermont history that begins all the way back in 10,000 BC, believe it or not. This was known as the Paleo-Indian period, and it also encompassed the late Paleo-Indian period, which took place around 8,000 and 7,000 BC. It was known as the last ice age. So that's when the Wisconsin Glacier finally started to melt, or at least what Americans call the Wisconsin Glacier. It has many different names across the world. But it started to melt and leave way for wetlands, and it actually formed the Champlain Sea, which is now Champlain Lake, as would so happen. And in the packets, I actually have a picture of that on the second page, just to show you the huge boundary that it set. It spanned over 20,500 square miles as far east as Annisburg Falls, as far west as Lake Ontario, and as far south as Whitehall, New York. And that was where the first Vermonters actually gravitated towards, which they came around 9,000-ish BC. It's a little up in the air as to when exactly they got here. But there have been sites around Lake Champlain and the Champlain Valley to at least support the idea that that is where they stayed primarily. And I made it a point of interest that I wanted to show people the change of culture and the change of times as it went on. And since projectile points, arrowheads, whatever you wish to call them, tend to be the fan favorite, I use those as an example. And all the pictures are in the packets as well. The way that archaeologists and anthropologists seem to have dictated when in a certain period of Native American history stops and starts is when certain artifacts stop showing up, and their radiocarbon dates, how far in the ground they were, etc. And that's not just for arrowheads, it's for scrapers, knives, drills, whatever other tools they used. There seems to be a change over time of how it's designed, what it's made out of, what it could have possibly been used for, etc. So those are the best bases to judge that off of. And for the Paleo-Indians, the biggest and most popular way to cut that line was with the Clovis point. It was wide and it had a flute down the middle, whether it was on one side or both. So imagine if you were holding a piece of rock, flat side towards you. You'd hit down on that flat base, and more than likely a large chunk would fall off and would kind of go down the middle. And then that would, of course, be repurposed for a scraper or a knife, what have you. So that would be used to place into the stick, staff, whatever you wish to call it, and it would tighten around the point, and then it would be tied down with whatever fiber or leather that they had. And that was primarily for the spears, not so much arrows at that time, because it was all hand-thrown spears. So they were fairly large, because they had to take down fairly large game. There really wasn't so much small game hunting back then. It was all something that was much bigger than you. And there were plenty of other points that went along with that. The Eden-like, the Kirk-stemmed, it all changed over time, and they all had their particular uses. The next phase is the Archaic periods, which overall encompassed from 7000 BC all the way to around 700 BC. And they're all split up from early, middle, late, and then transitional, which is, to my knowledge, a little bit argued as to whether the transitional Archaic period even existed. It could have been slumped in with the late Archaic to the next phase. It's a little bit under debate at the moment, so regardless, it's still there. It is believed that the Archaic culture actually began in Missouri and Illinois, and then spread outward. And the way that that was discovered was all of the Archaic-like artifacts were found to be the oldest in those areas, and then as archaeologists and anthropologists started spreading out, they started getting newer and newer. So that actually showed a portion of expanding culture over time, centered on one area, which I thought was very interesting. But little is known about this period in Vermont, mainly because there are no more than 30 sites total that express all of this, and a lot of it, specifically in the late Archaic period, was just found in cemeteries. So not only do we not want to disturb those areas as well, but those are also a little bit harder to come by.
When you say cemeteries, the immediate thing that comes to mind is the stone cemeteries that we obviously have in our culture. What do you mean by cemeteries? Native cemeteries?
Yes, absolutely.
What do those found look like?
They can range from just mounds of dirt that are very unnatural to if they were at a settlement site or where people thought that they had found certain things. Over time, the earth most likely would have gotten rid of the mound, and it looked like just flat land. But as people maybe had plowed their fields or whatever, things had come up.
Right.
So when archaeologists would go to dig there, they would find everything, of course, disturbed and spread about, but it showed that there was human remains, or at least portions of whatever remains was there, and certain things that were typical of like a burial ceremony.
So natives in Vermont buried their dead. They didn't dispose of bodies in another way, like burning, as far as we know.
Yeah, as far as we know, as far as I know at least. Of course, there could be some information that I missed, but as far as I can tell, they did bury.
Well, they sprang from the mounds out in the Midwest, right?
Yeah.
Which were fairly large.
Yes, the mounds out west, of course, were gigantic.
Yeah, because I knew one in Marietta, Ohio, which was very interesting, very tall.
Mm-hmm.
But so you're saying so that they spread from the people in that era. That's really neat.
That's the way that it seems. Of
Yeah.
course, it could have come from either out west, could have come from
Sure.
up north in Canada. It's up for debate as far as where that
Moving out.
moved from, as far as I know. But also a piece of information as well about myself that I forgot to mention. I lived out west in New Mexico for about 3 months, and I lived for 2 weeks with the Hopi Native Americans as well. So a bit of my knowledge comes from them, and it comes from that experience. And so just wanted to throw that out there.
That's great.
Totally forgot about that. Back to the late Archaic. At that point, copper actually started being shown. Copper beads to certain burial visages. They looked similar to axe heads. They could have very well been axe heads, from what I could tell, but they were buried with the bodies, most likely for just burial rites, rituals, etc.
These were not trade goods. This was prior to that.
Yeah, I mean, they could have been trade goods, because long-distance trade initially started to begin around the late Archaic woodland periods, so it very well could have just spread around.
Copper axes.
Yeah.
That seems like almost like a ceremonial tool. I mean,
Really
you're not gonna be
soft.
chopping down a maple with a copper axe.
Yeah, the pictures that I found, they looked very similar to an axe head.
Huh.
It intrigued me quite a bit. At this point in time as well, the Native Americans started to get very creative with their technologies. Of course, there was the dugout canoe that started showing up, the bolas, which bolas were just fiber attached to two rocks, and you'd hurl it at something moving, whether that was a land mammal or a bird, which they primarily used it for bird, from what we can tell. And the great invention was the Atlatl. And a lot of people don't know what that is, but you know what that is?
I think I do.
Sure.
So,
Like a spear thrower, right?
Yeah.
It lengthens the spear shaft in a way so you can increase the
yes.
distance.
So it was literally just a piece of wood with a little nub at the end. And so the spear would have an indentation in the back end of it. You put it on top of the little rod, place it there and hold it down with your two fingers. And as you would lean forward, you would let go and then huck it. So that was meant for more larger game because that put a lot of stopping power behind that spear, which was far superior to just throwing them because it offered two joints. It offered your elbow and it offered where the shaft met the little end of the rod. So that increased the stopping power exponentially, which allowed for a good amount of large game to be killed, which then expanded their diets, which then expanded their populations.
I can think of a modern example.
Okay.
If anybody owns a dog, the chuckets.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Exactly.
because my border collies, I can chuck it twice as far to get them to run across that field than I could with just my hand.
That is the perfect example. In fact, my college professor did that to show us exactly what to do as well. He was a tennis ball and a chuck it and just said, see what it does? That would hurt. That was a spear. Imagine that. And along with the growing population, the more food, the easier hunting. Also came the warming of the area. So then wetlands started to appear more, which allowed for smaller game and everything to start moving outward. And that included the Native Americans at the time. So that started spreading people east, west, and south towards us, but not exactly towards Clarendon at this point yet. And some points from that era were the Beekman Triangle, the Otter Creek Point, which is right in town, Otter Creek. That's actually one of the more common ones that have been found in sites along the Otter Creek, further north, and the Champlain Valley. So I like that one. The next phase was the woodland period and the contact period. And the woodland period and contact is where Clarendon comes into play. Woodland, again, split up from early, middle, late. It began in 700 BC and stretched to 1600 AD, our time. Contact began at 1600 AD for everybody. So it is no longer considered... how can I put it? There's a difference in history and with archaeology and anthropology between contact period with Europeans and prior to that. Europeans came in, everything amazingly changed from day one. So, while the artifacts may not have changed at that time, everything else did. So the reason why I talk about the woodland period being where Clarendon comes in, and specifically the middle and late woodland period, is because there was sites found that were very close to Clarendon. And it is on one of the pages. I have pictures from one of my researches. And in the middle woodland period, there was a site found in Sutherland Falls in Proctor, which fairly close to us. And then in the late woodland period, or a site was found in West Haven. I'm not sure if it was the one that I worked at, but it very well was close. Again, not too far away from us here. So, to a hypothesis, yes, these sites were very close to us, and we are in a waterway of the Otter Creek and even the Cold River as well. So I think that it could be safe to hypothesize that at some point, whether that was for hunting purposes or what have you, or trade, that some of these earlier people could have just passed through. Of course, water changes, and the Otter Creek didn't have the same path as it does now, but it's more than likely that they could have come this way for whatever reason. At least that's what I can guess. At this time as well, the food consumption increased dramatically. There was the domestication of plants, and they developed horticulture. Long-distance trade became more prominent. Selective borrowing of ideas also began to happen, along with a very clear cultural divide of you are you, I am me. Let's draw the line in the sand somewhere with that, with the cultures, with what we believe in, what we do, who we think we are. So that's
The development of different tribes is what we're talking about right now?
that's the way that it seemed.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit looser than that, but there was more of a cultural identity starting to show, where certain points were not being found in certain areas, and other artifacts not being found as well. So there was the divide of, that's your idea, this is our idea, we'll take your idea and we'll make it our own.
In terms of language families, was Vermont generally one large language family, or were there splits in that?
No, actually it was two, which began in the late Archaic period as well, but really showed prevalence in the woodland. It was like a Proto-Iroquoian and a Proto-Algonquin that kind of met in the middle. Mostly the Proto-Algonquin took over Vermont, but kind of on our side is where the Iroquoian and the Algonquin met.
I see.
So,
And the farther you got towards New York was more...
more Iroquois, Proto-Iroquoian at the time, for sure. And at this point as well, the specific points that were standard were the Levana point, which I believe I put a picture of that in there. Let me make sure, because I should have, if I didn't. I did.
Mm-hmm.
Levana Point. It was just a little triangle, little bitty triangle. That was very standard because yes, it was small. You can make it out of smaller pieces of material, and it was pretty sturdy for all intents and purposes. Another interesting one though was the Jack's Reef Point. These were very ingenuitive. They were thinner than most, and upon impact they actually shattered and turned into shrapnel. So it pretty much guaranteed a killed animal for you. There's not really many of them that are intact anymore because they blew on contact, and it most definitely cost more energy and more material and time for them to make these. So it kind of offset the work and the reward, but it was also very hard to balance that for them. That's why the Levana Point stayed standard for a long period of time. Thicker, smaller. If you broke off something off your spearhead, you could easily make it a Levana Point. Just as deadly, and got the job done for your hunts. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
When did they progress from the spear points to using the bow and arrow?
The spear. I mean, the spear points did still remain useful, but the bow and arrow got included around the early woodland period. Late Archaic was kind of the transition point of, all right, the Atlatl is great, but now that smaller game is starting to show up and the larger game is disappearing, it was more beneficial to have a bow and arrow. Because in all fairness, if you're trying to be sneaky and get up to a smaller creature, having to wind up and do a whole lot more movement would cause it to run, and then you'd have to try and aim in weird ways. Meanwhile, the bow and arrow was just, all right, simple, less movement, perfect for smaller game.
So those small, like the triangular point, were arrowheads as opposed to spear points. correct?
Absolutely, yes.
I have a question. I know like flint people think arrowheads. Do they make them out of like quartz or other stuff around, or what would they use? I guess.
They made them out of a lot. Quartzite was very popular. New England chert was actually one of the most common, which you could find in most places, from Proctor, the lakes, the Pulteney River area. West Haven was big for that as well. So chert and quartzite seem to be the biggest materials. As a matter of fact, I don't know about Clarendon Springs, but I'm sure there was a vein of something like that in Clarendon Springs, I think. Because Castleton actually had bought a piece of land in Clarendon that they used for the geology department, and they went there frequently to study the veins of the different rocks there. I don't exactly remember where that is, but I mean, if Castleton's geology department decides to look at something here, you have to guess that it would be at least semi-important and could be something of historical value as well.
Are you familiar with the Mount Tabor site that Dave Lacey explored?
Yes, I'm actually a good friend with Dave Lacey.
Okay.
He's told me a lot about it. I have seen it. I haven't done anything there, but I have seen it before. So there's two sites that I had talked about, the Sutherland Falls and the one in West Haven. Like I said, fairly close. People could have moved for a number of reasons. We couldn't tell you why at this point, because, I'm gonna be honest, not a lot's been done in the Rutland County area, at least here in Clarendon or in Tinmouth. It really hasn't been a point of interest, so we're all just kind of hypothesizing here at this point.
When you talk about West Haven, are you talking about the Gaelic site?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And that was the site that I had worked on for a couple of years as well. So who were the people that could have been in Clarendon? That is two possibilities. Of course, there were other groups in Vermont, but none of them came as close as the Western Abenaki and the Mohicans. So the Mohicans were west of the Green Mountains and south of the Otter Creek watershed. They didn't exactly live in that spot, but they did claim it as their territory for hunts at specific times of year. The Western Abenaki, on the other hand, had a large vein of Vermont to themselves, mostly up north. And it's actually kind of general acceptance at this point that the Abenaki are the descendants of the late woodland peoples up in the Champlain Valley and possibly further down here, like at the Gaelic site. In fact, the Abenaki sent envoys to the site to dig with us and to see what the area was like, just especially in case we came across any remains, because then they would have had to do special rituals and so on. So it was very interesting to work with them.
Garret, good
Yes.
question. Is there a difference in the Mohicans that you're speaking of in Vermont and the Mohicans, which I believe are found in Connecticut?
Yes, there is a huge difference between those two groups. Yes, they sound the same, but completely different veins. I don't think they even spoke the same dialect, or anywhere near the same dialect. I'm more than certain on that, but I could be wrong. The Mohicans or the Mohicans, both spellings and pronunciations are correct. You just switch an A for an O. They were more closely related to the Western Abenaki, mainly because they actually shared the Algonquin language to a degree. Different dialect, but especially early on, it didn't cause any rifts. They could easily go to each other and understand what they were saying. So they were more closely related to each other than anybody else. And yes, the Mohicans are the ones that, who was the guy that wrote, I don't remember. Whoever wrote Last of the Mohicans, that was the romanticized version of those people as well. But as far as their territories and dividing lines were, It was west of the Green Mountains and south of the Otter Creek watershed. And the reason why I say that it could have been either one of those two was, like I said, they shared some common language. They would have had some sort of communication and some contact with each other. The long distance trade was still very prominent at that time. So they could have easily, during the Mohicans, certain times of year when they would come up this way to hunt, they could have crossed over into Western Abenaki lands. They could have hunted with each other. It's a very likely possibility that at least the Mohicans could have come up this way through the Otter Creek, following for the animals or whatever sources they were looking for. And the Western Abenaki, of course, they touched borders, and as it would seem, they actually had settlements at the at the mouth of the Otter Creek, not upwards, south. So, I don't remember exactly where the Otter Creek ends, at least now.
Or starts.
Or starts.
It goes north.
Yeah. I don't know exactly where
Yeah.
it kind of.
Dorset,
It's in
wouldn't
the
it?
swamp down at Dorset.
I think you're right.
On the
Is that-
east side of
Yeah.
Route Well, it 7. flows north into Lake Champlain. That's
Right,
where-
right.
North.
6 miles west of the Gens,
Okay.
town of Canton.
Okay. Well, regardless, they would have. It's been recorded there was a site in the Dorset area. So, so yeah, if they were that close to us here in Clarendon, it's kind of hard to not hypothesize that they did come through town. However, it is not proven that they had any site in Clarendon. We could have just been a stop along the way, or they just passed through. But regardless, I think it's pretty safe to guess that they came through.
There's my tax preparer's just down the road here, and he's probably a mile away, and he's collected hundreds of stone tools and artifacts he's right on the river over there. So it's interesting, but yeah, it's like maybe a mile from here. But, so it's pretty, we're doing something there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So that just furthers the point.
Yeah.
A little bit about each group because I feel like they deserve it. The Mohican, their self-name was Mohicaniac. I believe that's how you say it. I'm sorry if I got it wrong. It means from the waters that are never still. But they were known to the Dutch and the English as river Indians and to the French as loups, which I believe translates to wolves.
Wolf, yeah, because
Loops.
loup
Yeah.
garou, yeah, it's a wolf.
Wolf.
Yeah.
And before colonization, there were at least 5 bands that spread out over their area, and they were interconnected by 3 matrilineal clans. So it just further organized them. In the Age of Contact, their major settlements were near the Upper Hudson River area and Upper Housatonic River. But as I said before, they did claim this at least southwestern corner of Vermont as their territory. They didn't come here to settle, they came here specifically for hunting parties at certain times of year. The Western Abenaki, they stretched out from the Eastern Abenaki in Maine, and sadly, because they are from Vermont, they kind of got the short end of the stick as far as their ethnologies and their studies go. So there really isn't a lot about the Western Abenaki as it stands right now.
They didn't even get recognized until,
Yep.
was it a decade ago even?
No, they were they were recognized until 2006.
Yeah.
After it was given to them in 1976, and then a year later got overturned.
Yeah. It was Howard Dean, I think, wasn't it? The governor at the time that recognized them.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it was. And after 30 long years, they finally got recognition, and they finally were able to claim their right.
Well, that doesn't have a lot to do with their history, though.
And it's
I mean, that has to do with whether they exist today.
yes,
I mean, their history is very clear. They pretty much occupied northern Vermont and hunted in southern Vermont. They had seasonal settlements on the Connecticut, at Swanton, probably at around Virgins. But they were organized by families, and did not have permanent settlements, which allowed Ira Allen to lie that there were no Indians in Vermont.
Wait, who said that?
Ira Allen,
Ira Allen? I'm not familiar with that name.
Ethan's brother.
Ethan's brother.
Oh, jeez.
One of the land developers from Connecticut.
Ah, got it.
Ethan, Ira, and Welcome.
Ah,
The Allen brothers.
right. I thought we were talking about somebody who was a little bit younger than that, but my apologies.
You're saying a little bit shifty. He sure was.
But as far as them being recognized, it does matter to their history, because as far as in the books, that does, if they're not recognized, that does kind of cut off the time of when you can, or when the legal system could say they exist. So it's their recent history, but still nonetheless very important to them. And their first recorded bit of history was supposedly in 1615, when they were supposedly met by the French Recollect Order, which was just a group of missionaries. But there was sadly no written documentation to say that they had actually met, so it kind of got tossed out the window of, we can't say officially, but in 1642 they were officially met for the first time. And oddly enough, the French did actually have a lot of communication with them, but they didn't keep fantastic notes, little to nothing actually. Meanwhile, the Dutch and English kept fantastic notes about the Eastern Abenaki. So even then, not much was talked about or written about them. Who knows if it was just because of Vermont? I don't know. And their villages ranged, and I'm giving their villages focus because if they actually did have some sort of settlement, whether that was temporary or maybe permanent and nobody's found it yet, I want to just give a sense of scale for what this could have looked like. The villages comprised of populations ranging from 500 people to 1,000 plus people, never really going above 1,500. As the maritime settlement, I think, was a grand total of 1,400. And they had several long rectangular houses. It was all divided, of course, by family of patrilocal or matrilocal, whoever lived with who.
I'm surprised to hear that, because growing up, you know, you learned scant in school about, it was just kind of this thing that was passed over. Like, yeah, we had Indians, they never really lived here, and moving on. You hear a lot about the Iroquois with their long houses, and I always assumed that the natives that lived in Vermont lived in more like huts, what are they called, wigwams, I believe. And that's what we were always taught, that there were longhouses here. But what you're saying is they did have something similar to longhouses.
They did. It was actually kind of varied depending on who wanted what. Especially when it came to the families, it started off as a little square, and then they added on, and then they added on. Just to keep the family together.
Pods.
Yes, exactly, pods.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there were wigwams, etc. Like if somebody went unmarried, or if the family it started a new branch, then that's how it stayed for a while. But eventually, over time, it would be added on every so often. I'm not going to get into the social organization or the political organization of the villages, because that would take a long time, and quite honestly, it's confusing even to me to have all the pictures of, this couple went to live with their father, that means that they're a part of this branch now, and that means that they live in this area now. There's a lot. I'm sorry, sir, did you have a question?
There's an excellent book about the Western Abenaki, and I'm sorry to say that the name of the author escapes me at the moment. But are you familiar with it?
The original Vermonters book?
No.
Oh, no.
No, this is about the Western Abenaki.
Oh, well,
The original Vermonters goes back a lot further.
yes. I have not found one that specifically named them. I know it was. I went to the Rutland room in the library, and it had a list of specific ones that absolutely could have mentioned the Western Abenaki, but
Yeah, there is one with a title. Is that one of Majorie Powers?
No,
No.
What was the title, Graham?
it's a history, it is a history of the
Oh,
Western
okay.
Abenaki.
Yes.
I'm having trouble remembering the author's name. Sorry.
it's alright, I'm not familiar with
But I read it, I got it as a paperback from the Rutland Library.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah, I've got it too. I've had it for about 20 years, so.
Yeah, it's
Western
old.
Abenakis of Vermont? There's a particular book
The
on
Western
list.
Abenakis, now, there's maybe more to the title, but Western Abenakis is like.
That sounds
you said.
familiar. It's not, it was, that sounds like one of them that was on the list that I found, but I don't think the library had it at the time, when I looked for it at least. Didn't show up.
It wasn't Gene Brink, was it?
Was it Gene Brink?
Doesn't sound
How
familiar.
about Haviland?
I keep thinking Callaway, but I'm not.
Yes, you're right. The guy from Dartmouth.
Yes,
Callaway?
Callaway.
Where two or three are gathered, we can put these things together. It's good stuff.
We work together, we find it out.
Colin Callaway. Is
Nice,
that found familiar?
Yes.
Western Abenakis of Vermont.
Yes,
Yes.
nice.
Yes.
What's your first name?
Colin.
Colin.
C-O-L-I-N,
Okay, okay.
Colin.
right.
We got it.
Yeah, good start.
Good job, us. We did it.
I should have remembered that. My son is named Colin.
So, as far as why I at least could, and why other archaeologists or anthropologists could hypothesize that these two groups came to Clarendon was, as I said before, the Otter Creek, big waterway. Clarendon Springs, perhaps, might have been a reason. Whatever, maybe they needed materials for their tools, and they just, if they were out hunting, or specifically the Mohicans, or if the Abenaki were here, they could have very well just gone up to Clarendon Springs, or to whatever area that it was that Castleton has a hold on, that I don't know where it is. I tried to figure it out, to no avail. They wouldn't tell me. But yeah, there's a number of reasons. Pick which one that you may, because at this point all of them are just as viable as the rest as to why. But I can say at least with confidence that they came here for some reason. Maybe not to settle, but to come through. And there was actually one reference to Native American settlement in Clarendon. Only one that I could find, and even at that, it could be confused. On the back page, there's a Vermont Historical Magazine snippet that talks about Henry Hodges and Joseph Congdon. Henry Hodges, the oldest son of the doctor, born July 30th, 1779, died November 27th, 1840. About 1810, he purchased the farm now owned by Joseph Congdon, adjoining his father's former property on the south. In 1842, he erected the dwelling house now on it and made that place his home for life. On this farm, west of the road, there had formerly been an Indian village, from one of whose inhabitants a piece of land about half a mile northwest of the church took and long preserved the name of the John's Lot. Some remains of the house were to be seen as late as 1820. That is the only piece of recorded history that actually mentions Clarendon and there being a settlement of some kind. Am I positive that it was a permanent one? No. I would be a little bit surprised, especially given the regular sizes. Could it have been smaller? Absolutely. Could it have been just a small village, like a little breakaway village, or maybe just a permanent hunting area that was frequently visited? That is very likely. It could have just been a little stop along the way that they said, "Oh, all right, you want this area? We'll move downriver a bit as our rest stop from now on." As far as it's saying that it was a settlement, that could be easily confused or taken a different way, because the verbiage that was used to describe those things back then, much different compared to how it is now.
Were there, to your knowledge, were there permanent settlements that have been proven in New Hampshire
In New Hampshire? Oh yeah.
and in Massachusetts?
Not of the Western Abenaki, at
Okay,
least.
but
Or
native.
Yes.
Yeah, and
Sure.
in New York.
Yes.
So doesn't it seem odd that we have this Vermont-shaped?
Just pass through.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just a nice little southwestern corner of Vermont that says there's no settlement here. But everywhere up north, though, absolutely permanent settlements
Right.
galore, especially around the
Like
Champlain Valley.
Yeah.
But
Permanent places where families came together. They weren't settlements in the sense that we think of settlement as a place where people build their houses and they live there year round. They would come together in the summer and grow their crops, but end of the summer they'd spread out in family groups, and there'd be relatively few people left in the what you call the permanent settlement.
recent studies have shown something similar to that. Maybe not so much that they all spread out and left the area, but especially during the winter time, it actually was shown through some extra excavation that they actually did stay relatively close together in those bigger settlements. But yes, they did, on the occasion, they did move along just to spread out a little bit more. But recent studies have shown that that has at least changed a little bit. So,
Read Mr. Calloway's book.
I will. But yes, as far as anything for Clarendon, there is nothing else beyond that. But I can only hope that there would be some sort of archaeological interest in this area at some point. As far
Here,
as that goes,
I have a question. When a site is found,
Mhm.
what is the typical way it's found? Is there research first and then go out looking for it, or is it something that people just stumble
By
on
chance, yeah.
and then draws the attention to it by accident?
I would say that it's 70% by accident, 30% by research. Because there are the archaeologists and anthropologists who will look at a map and who will look at all the sites and say, I'm seeing a trend on this point of the river. There's a blank space, and it could be very big. And they're like, I bet there's something in this area because of XYZ. Or it could have been a farmer who just said, I've been plowing my field for years, and over the past 70 years, my father and I have collected all these arrowheads that were secluded in this portion of my field. And then they'll contact state or university or whatever, and all of a sudden you start finding sites or just a smattering of whatever was left. So.
Garret, I have friends that are in the Mohawk Valley, down around Amsterdam area, and also in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and especially the Mohawk River Valley, they find what they call kettle points,
Mm-hmm.
which are arrowheads made from the copper kettles that the Dutch would bring up.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
And they would turn them into what they call these kettle points.
Mhm.
Have you know anything about those, or have any of them ever been found in Vermont or anything like that? Or is that just the 1600 era where the Europeans started coming in and bringing their metal pots?
I'm 80% sure that it has been found in Vermont, because I remember that being talked about when I was working at the Gaelic site. No, I don't believe any of that was found, but I know that Dave Lacey had talked about it, Matt Moriarty had talked about it a couple times as well. I'm unfamiliar with that specific point, but I do know that it has been around, and it wouldn't surprise me if after contact at any point they just took whatever old pieces of metal and things that anybody didn't want and fashioned it to their own needs.
I can show you one, because the friend I'm talking about actually gave me an arrow that was built by a Native American as if it were done back then, and he attached one of the kettle points that he had found to it.
Mhm.
So I can kind of show you not only the point, but the arrow that they fabricated with it. So
That's very interesting.
I'll show you that.
Yeah, please do. It's great. If anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer anything.
So what's next? You talked about more education. What are you doing now? I mean, this is obviously an avocation, or
Yes,
yeah,
it is.
but it's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm actually working to be a Vermont State Trooper,
Oh, great.
as a matter of fact. So
Great.
I'm in the process of that.
All right.
So fingers crossed.
See you on the road.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
Seems to me that in the 17th and 18th century, natives were at each other's throats and having some real battles. That way back, some of those periods that you're talking about, was similar or different?
I would have to say it was different, because it wasn't so much. I would like to say that it wasn't as bad, but at the same time, you know, we can't say for sure how different it exactly was. Of course, there might have been land disputes, blood feuds, things of that degree that occurred, but there, at least to my knowledge, there hasn't been much proof of anything larger scale than what we saw in the contact period, where it was more or less driven on by the Europeans, who came here and said, we want what those people have, you're our allies, you're going to help us.
Yeah.
Or if they already had some sort of discontent, it would have just been more fuel of like, oh, okay, we'll help each other out. We don't like these people either. We have issues with this specific band. Let's do something about it. And then, of course, there was all the wars that occurred, like King Philip's War, etc., that happened specifically in New England and close by, that actually the Abenaki and the Mohicans both contributed to. So I would have to say it's quite different, especially for the reasons why.
Do you have any, or do you know of any evidence that the tribes of Maine, such as the Penobscot, and I know I'm reaching out there, ever journeyed south into Vermont? Was there any sort of trade evidence, or, because there's a lot of documentation of those tribes, and
Yes.
I'm just wondering if there was any sort of bleed through when it came to Vermont.
It wouldn't surprise me. That was talked about briefly in my studies at Castleton, of how far these New England tribes might have connected with each other and communicated, what kind of long distance trade they had.
Because it was the same language family, right? They were,
Yes.
They were Abenaki as well. Yeah.
Yes, they shared the Algonquin dialect.
Yeah.
So the connection was there, absolutely. And there have been, oh shoot, I can't exactly remember where, but there were the whale tail weights found that came from Maine and from the specific tribe in Maine that I can't remember, and it was found in Vermont.
Oh, okay.
Cavendish.
Cavendish? Yes, that's thank you.
Interesting.
So there is that proof. Not a whole lot, but there is.
Have you ever read the book Women of the Dawn by Bunny McBride?
No.
It was written about 20 years ago, and it's a fantastic telling of Native women in Maine. I think it dwells on mostly 4, maybe 5 women that were well documented at that time, and I believe one of them actually talked about her family traveling south to the Great Lake, referring to Lake Champlain, during summer for hunting. And it's just, I just wondered if there was any. But that's a great book. If you're interested in
I
reading
will
that,
read
it's a
that.
really good one.
Absolutely.
Women of the Dawn by Bunny McBride.
Women of the Dawn. Okay.
But yeah, I just wondered if any
My knowledge does not go far north or far east. It's kind of been localized to this area. So, but I can guarantee anybody else, Matt Moriarty, Dave Lacey, they know all about it.
Well, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
If I find an artifact, can a chemical analysis be done on that to determine source of the quarry that it came from, without destroying the artifact? I haven't asked Lacey that, but I'll see next time I see him. Let me tell you why I asked this,
Okay.
because up at Lake Dunmore, my neighbor found a wonderful point about this big, and shown to the late Jim Peterson, and he said, yeah, that either came from a quarry on Mount Independence or somewhere up in Swanton. And I haven't done a comparison yet, but I thought that was intriguing. That one.
There could be, absolutely, without breaking the artifact. If there was just a little flake that you could get off of it, absolutely that could be done. As far as finding the specific quarry, yeah, I'd say like 80% you could, but there is also that room for error where you couldn't find the specific place, but you could get the general area of like, okay, so it could have come from this, out of all these geological records, it could have come out of this 10-foot radius area. Or
Yeah.
not 10 foot, 10 mile,
Yeah.
let's just
Yeah.
say. But it could absolutely be done
Okay,
like that.
that's close enough, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no problem. Any other questions?
Well, thank you, Garrett.
Excellent.